When the radio crackled with static and then went silent, 480 Marines knew they were completely alone. Cut off from backup, surrounded by enemy forces in hostile territory, their commanding officers had written them off as acceptable losses.
But what the enemy didn't know was that among those abandoned soldiers were two sisters whose ink-covered arms told stories of pain, survival, and deadly precision. The locals had laughed when they first saw Maya and Elena Rodriguez step off the transport truck.
Two young women covered in tattoos, carrying sniper rifles that seemed too big for their frames. The enemy fighters had mocked them through intercepted communications, calling them the decorated girls, who would be easy targets.
They had no idea they were about to face two of the most lethal marksmen the military had ever trained. In the next 72 hours, these sisters would prove that being underestimated was their greatest weapon.
While 480 Marines fought for their lives with dwindling ammunition and no hope of rescue, Maya and Elena would systematically eliminate every threat that stood between their brothers in arms and survival. This is the true story of how two tattooed sisters turned the tide of an impossible battle and saved an entire battalion that their own command had abandoned to die. The desert sun was merciless as it beat down on Forward Operating Base Scorpion, a makeshift military outpost carved into the rocky terrain of the contested border region. Maya Rodriguez adjusted her scope for the 100th time that morning, her tattooed fingers steady despite the chaos erupting around her. At 26, she was the older of the two Rodriguez sisters, and every piece of ink on her arms told a story. The rose with thorns on her right forearm honored their grandmother who had raised them after their parents died in a car crash. The eagle spreading its wings across her shoulder blade represented the first enemy sniper she had taken out during her first deployment. Her younger sister Elena, 24, lay prone beside her on the rocky outcropping that served as their sniper's nest. Elena's tattoos were newer but equally meaningful. A compass on her wrist pointed toward home, while a pair of wings on her back reminded her of their shared dream to fly planes before they both ended up as ground-based snipers instead. The sisters had enlisted together, trained together, and requested to be deployed together. Most commanders thought it was a bad idea to have family members in the same unit, but their shooting scores were too impressive to ignore.
Colonel Marcus Webb paced nervously in the command bunker below them, his radio crackling with increasingly desperate messages from headquarters. The intelligence had been wrong.
Dead wrong. Instead of facing a small insurgent group, the 480 Marines at Forward Operating Base Scorpion were surrounded by nearly 2,000 enemy fighters. They had walked straight into a trap, and now the higher-ups were making calculations that Webb didn't want to hear. "Sir, we need immediate extraction for our people." Webb spoke into the radio, sweat dripping despite the air conditioning in the bunker. "We're outnumbered 4-1, and our ammunition supplies are running low." The voice that came back was cold and mechanical. "Colonel Webb, extraction is not possible at this time. Intelligence suggests enemy anti-aircraft capabilities are too strong. Hold your position and await further orders." Webb knew what that meant in military speak. They were being abandoned. The cost of losing helicopters and pilots to save 480 Marines was deemed too high by the generals sitting safely in their offices hundreds of miles away. His men and women were now expendable. Maya heard the commotion from the command bunker through her earpiece. She had been monitoring communications all morning, and she could read between the lines. Her tattooed hand tightened on her rifle grip as she realized what was happening. They weren't just fighting for territory anymore. They were fighting for survival with no hope of backup. Elena noticed her sister's tension immediately. The two had developed an almost telepathic connection during their years of training and deployment together. "What's the situation down there?" Elena whispered, her eyes still pressed to her scope as she tracked enemy movements in the valley below. "We're on our own," Maya replied quietly. "Command just cut us loose." Elena's jaw tightened, but her hands remained steady. She had always been the more emotional of the two sisters, but when it came to combat, she was ice cold.
"How many targets can you count in Sector 7? Maya swept her scope across the designated area.
12 confirmed. Looks like they're setting up a mortar position. She paused, calculating distance and wind speed automatically. Range 800 meters. The enemy fighters below moved with confidence, clearly believing they had the upper hand. Many of them had heard about the two tattooed women among the Marines and had laughed about it over their own radio communications. In their culture, women were not supposed to be warriors, and the idea of female snipers seemed like a cruel joke. They had no idea that Maya had scored 847 confirmed kills in her 3 previous deployments, while Elena had 623. Together, the Rodriguez sisters were the most lethal sniper team in their entire division. Lieutenant Jake Morrison crawled up to their position, keeping low to avoid enemy fire. At 32, Morrison was Maya's spotter,
and had worked with the sisters for over a year. He had initially been skeptical about working with female snipers, but after seeing them in action, he had become their most vocal supporter. The tattoos that covered their arms had initially made him think they were troublemakers, but he quickly learned that each piece of ink represented a milestone in their military careers.
"Ladies, Colonel Webb wants to see you in the command bunker," Morrison said, his voice grim. "Situation briefing in 5 minutes." Maya and Elena exchanged glances.
They had been through enough combat to know that emergency briefings usually meant bad news. They carefully secured their weapons and made their way down the rocky slope, keeping to the shadows to avoid enemy snipers who were undoubtedly watching for movement. The command bunker was packed with Marines, all of them looking tense and worried. Colonel Webb stood at the center, a tactical map spread out before him, showing their current position surrounded by red markers indicating enemy forces.
The situation looked hopeless from every angle. "Listen up, people," Webb began, his voice carrying the weight of command.
"I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Headquarters has classified our position as non-recoverable. We are officially on our own until further notice." A murmur of anger and disbelief rippled through the assembled Marines.
These were professional soldiers who had served multiple tours, but being abandoned by their own command was something that shook them to their core. Webb continued, "We have enough ammunition for approximately 18 hours of sustained combat. Water supplies will last us 3 days if we ration carefully. Our job now is to hold this position and inflict as much damage as possible on enemy forces." Sergeant First Class Rodriguez raised her hand. "Sir, what's the enemy's estimated strength?" "Intelligence puts them at roughly 2,000 fighters with heavy weapons and mortar support." Webb replied, "They have us surrounded, but they're being cautious. They know we're well-trained and heavily armed." Elena spoke up from the back of the group. "Sir, they're also overconfident. We've been monitoring their communications, and they think this is going to be easy. They're making mistakes because they underestimate us."
Webb nodded.
"That's our only advantage right now. They don't know what they're dealing with." He looked directly at the Rodriguez sisters. "I'm counting on our sniper teams to thin their numbers and slow their advance. Every shot needs to count because we don't have ammunition to waste." The meeting broke up with Marines returning to their positions, but the mood was somber. Everyone understood that they might not survive the next few days. Families back home would receive folded flags and empty promises about their service and sacrifice. Maya and Elena returned to their sniper's nest as the sun began to set, painting the desert landscape in shades of orange and red. The enemy forces were using the approaching darkness to move closer, thinking they could use the cover to advance undetected. They were wrong. Elena adjusted her night vision scope and immediately spotted movement in the valley below. "Contact. 11 o'clock, 600 meters. She whispered into her radio. "Looks like an advanced scouting party, 8 targets." Maya swept her own scope across the area and confirmed the sighting. "I've got visual." Taking the shot on my mark, she controlled her breathing, feeling her heartbeat slow, as she entered the focused state that had made her one of the military's most effective snipers. The tattoo of a stopwatch on her wrist reminded her that timing was everything in this business. The first shot rang out across the desert, and one of the enemy scouts dropped immediately. Before his companions could react, Elena had fired as well, taking down a second target. The remaining 6 enemy fighters scrambled for cover, but they were caught in the open with nowhere to hide. Over the next 30 minutes, the Rodriguez sisters systematically eliminated the entire scouting party. Their shots were precise, deadly, and spaced out just enough to make the enemy think there were multiple sniper teams operating in the area. Each kill was clean and professional, but Maya and Elena felt no satisfaction. They were simply doing their job, protecting their fellow Marines who had been abandoned by the very command they had sworn to serve. As night fell completely, the radio chatter from enemy forces revealed their growing frustration. They had expected to overrun the Marine position quickly, but the accurate sniper fire was forcing them to be more cautious. Leaders were arguing about strategy, and some were beginning to question whether they had underestimated their opponents. Colonel Webb made his rounds to different positions throughout the night, checking on his Marines and trying to maintain morale. When he reached the Rodriguez sisters' position, he found them cleaning their weapons with the methodical precision that had become their trademark. "How are we looking out there?" Webb asked quietly. Maya looked up from her rifle maintenance. "We've confirmed 14 kills tonight, sir. Enemy forces are regrouping about 1,200 meters out, but they're being more careful now. Word is getting around that we're not the easy target they expected." Alina added, "The communications suggest they're planning a coordinated assault at dawn. They're bringing up heavy weapons and trying to call in air support." Webb's expression darkened. "Any word on that air support?" "Negative, sir," Maya replied. "Sounds like they're having trouble with their aircraft. Could be maintenance issues, or maybe they're saving their air assets for bigger targets. Klaus is current. nodded grimly. Get some rest while you can. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. As Webb moved on to check other positions, the sisters settled in for a few hours of sleep, taking turns on watch duty. As it passed, they had learned long ago that rest was a weapon in combat, and exhausted snipers missed shots that could mean the difference between life and death for their fellow Marines. The tattoos on their arms seemed to tell the story of their journey to this moment. Maya's collection included a small anchor that represented her first successful mission, while Elena had a pair of crossed rifles that honored their sniper training instructor who had believed in them when others doubted. Each piece of ink was a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had sacrificed to earn their place among the military's elite marksmen. Dawn was still hours away, but both sisters knew that the real battle was just beginning. They had been written off by their own command, mocked by their enemies, and left to die in a hostile desert.
But Maya and Elena Rodriguez had never backed down from a fight, and they weren't about to start now. Their fellow Marines were counting on them, and the tattooed sisters were prepared to prove that being underestimated was the last mistake their enemies would ever make.
Dawn broke over the desert with the sound of incoming artillery. Maya Rodriguez jolted awake as the first mortar rounds exploded against the rocky outcroppings around forward operating base Scorpion.
She had been catching a few hours of sleep while Elena maintained watch, but the enemy's dawn assault had begun earlier than expected. Contact. 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 Elena's voice crackled over the radio as she pressed her eye to her scope. Multiple targets advancing from the north and east. Estimate 60 combatants in the first wave. Maya was instantly alert, her years of combat experience kicking in as she grabbed her rifle and moved to her firing position. The tattoo of a phoenix on her left shoulder seemed particularly fitting as she rose from sleep to face what might be their final battle. She had gotten that tattoo after surviving an IED explosion during her second deployment, and it reminded her that she could rise from any destruction. The enemy forces were advancing in coordinated waves, using the early morning light to their advantage. They had clearly spent the night positioning themselves for this assault, and their confidence showed in their movement. Many of the fighters were openly mocking the Marines over their radio communications, making crude jokes about the tattooed girls who thought they could play soldier. Colonel Webb's voice came through their earpieces, steady despite the chaos erupting around them. All sniper teams, this is command. Priority targets are anyone carrying heavy weapons or communications equipment. Make every shot count. Maya adjusted her scope and immediately identified a high-value target. An enemy commander was positioned about 700 meters out, directing the assault with hand signals and a radio. The man was clearly experienced, keeping to cover while maintaining visual control of his forces, but he had made one crucial mistake. He had positioned himself where Maya had a clear shot through a gap in the rocks. Taking the commander at 700 meters, Maya whispered into her radio, "Wind speed 4 miles per hour from the west." Elena was tracking a different target, an enemy fighter carrying what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. "I've got the RPG at 650 meters, taking the shot after you." Maya controlled her breathing, feeling her heart rate slow as she entered the zone that had made her legendary among Marine snipers. The stopwatch tattoo on her wrist reminded her that in sniper warfare, timing was everything. Too early and the target might move. Too late and her fellow Marines could die. The shot rang out across the desert, and the enemy commander dropped instantly. His radio scattered across the rocky ground, and the coordinated assault began to falter as subordinate leaders tried to figure out what had happened to their commanding officer. Elena's shot followed 3 seconds later, and the RPG-wielding fighter collapsed before he could fire at the Marine positions. The precision of the 2 shots sent ripples of confusion through the enemy ranks. They had expected to face desperate defenders, not professional marksmen who could eliminate key targets at will. Lieutenant Morrison crawled up to their position, keeping low as bullets whined overhead. "Command wants a status report on enemy numbers and positioning," he said, his face grim with concentration. Maya swept her scope across the battlefield while Elena continued to engage targets. "I'm counting approximately 40 hostiles remaining in the first wave. They're regrouping behind that ridgeline at 800 meters. Looks like they're waiting for reinforcements before pressing the attack." Morrison relayed the information while the sisters continued their deadly work. Each shot was carefully planned and executed with the precision that had earned them their reputation. Maya's tattoo collection included a small hourglass on her ankle, a reminder that every second counted in combat. Time was always running out, whether it was ammunition, daylight, or the lives of the Marines counting on them. The enemy forces had clearly underestimated the defensive capabilities of the Marine position.
Their intelligence had told them they were facing a demoralized unit that had been abandoned by their command.
What they encountered instead was a group of professional soldiers who had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. Elena's radio crackled with intercepted enemy communications.
She had studied Arabic during her military training, and what she was hearing made her blood run cold. Maya, they're calling up their second wave. Estimate 150 fighters, plus they're bringing up a technical with a mounted machine gun. Maya grimaced as she tracked the movement of enemy forces regrouping in the distance.
A technical pickup truck with a heavy machine gun mounted in the bed could devastate their positions if it got within range.
Range to the technical?
1,200 meters in closing.
Elena replied.
That's a long shot, but I think I can make it. Long-range shooting was Maya's specialty, and she had made kills at distances that seemed impossible to other snipers. The eagle tattoo on her shoulder blade had been earned with a shot at 1,347 meters, a record that still stood in her unit.
I'll take it. You cover the infantry. The technical was moving slowly across the desert floor, its gunner scanning for targets while the driver navigated around rocks and debris. Maya calculated wind speed, distance, and the target's movement pattern. At 1,200 meters, she would have to account for bullet drop, wind drift, and the possibility that the target might change direction. She had only one shot. Miss and the technical would close the distance and unleash devastating fire on her fellow Marines. Make the hit, and the enemy's second wave would lose their heavy weapons support. Maya's breathing slowed as she entered the focus state that had made her a legend. The compass tattoo on Elena's wrist caught her eye, and she thought about home, about the people they were fighting to protect, about the Marines who were counting on them to hold the line. The shot echoed across the desert like thunder. 1,200 meters away, the technical's driver slumped over the steering wheel as Maya's bullet found its mark.
The vehicle veered sharply to the left and rolled over, crushing the machine gunner and eliminating the enemy's heavy weapons advantage in one perfectly placed shot. Elena whooped softly as she watched the technical crash.
Outstanding shot, sister. That's going to make them think twice about their next move.
The enemy forces were indeed reconsidering their strategy. Their radio chatter revealed growing concern about the accuracy of the Marine snipers. Leaders were arguing about whether to continue the assault or wait for additional support. Some were beginning to suspect that they were facing a much more professional force than their intelligence had suggested. Sergeant Rodriguez's radio crackled with the transmission from Colonel Webb. "Rodriguez team, this is command. Outstanding work on that technical. Intelligence suggests the enemy is bringing up mortars for indirect fire support.
Can you identify their positions?" Maya and Elena swept their scopes across the battlefield, looking for signs of mortar teams setting up their weapons. Mortars were particularly dangerous because they could fire over obstacles and didn't require a direct line of sight to their targets. If the enemy got their mortars operational, they could devastate the Marine positions without exposing themselves to sniper fire. "Contact," Elena whispered.
"I've got what looks like a mortar team setting up at 11 o'clock, approximately 1,000 meters, 3 personnel visible, 1 carrying what appears to be mortar rounds."
Maya shifted her position to get a better angle on the target area. "Confirmed.
I can see 2 mortars being assembled. They're using that cluster of rocks for concealment, but they're not completely hidden."
The mortar teams were working quickly but carefully, clearly experienced in setting up their weapons under combat conditions. Maya knew that once those mortars were operational, the Marine position would become untenable.
They had to eliminate the threat before the enemy could begin their indirect fire barrage. Taking the shot on the mortar team leader, Maya announced over the radio, "Elena, can you hit the ammunition carrier?" "Roger that. I have a clear shot." The 2 sisters fired within seconds of each other, their bullets finding their marks with devastating accuracy. The mortar team scattered as their leader and ammunition carrier dropped, abandoning their weapons as they sought cover from the deadly sniper fire.
But Maya and Elena weren't finished. They had identified a second mortar position, and they systematically eliminated the crew before they could complete their setup.
Each shot was precise and deadly, turning what should have been an overwhelming enemy advantage into a liability as crews abandoned their weapons rather than risk exposure to the Marine snipers. The enemy radio chatter was becoming increasingly frantic. Unit leaders were reporting heavy casualties and requesting permission to withdraw from the assault. The confidence they had shown at the beginning of the attack was evaporating as they realized they were facing professional soldiers who had no intention of giving up. Colonel Webb made his way to the sniper position during a brief lull in the fighting. He found Maya and Elena calmly cleaning their weapons and checking their ammunition supplies. Both sisters were covered in dust and sweat, but their focus remained sharp and professional. "Status report," Webb said quietly, crouching low to avoid exposing himself to enemy fire. Maya looked up from her rifle maintenance. We've confirmed 37 kills since dawn, sir. Enemy forces are regrouping at 1,500 meters, but they're being much more cautious. Their leadership structure appears to be degraded.
Elena added, intercepted communications suggest they're waiting for air support before continuing the assault. They're also discussing bringing up heavier weapons, possibly including anti-tank rockets.
Webb's expression was grim. Our ammunition supplies are holding up better than expected thanks to your accurate fire. But we're still outnumbered by a significant margin. Any ideas on how we can continue to even the odds? Maya pointed to her tactical map, which was marked with enemy positions she had identified through her scope.
They're using that wadi, that dry riverbed, as a movement corridor. If we can position ourselves to cover that approach, we can create a killing field that forces them to attack from less favorable angles. Elena nodded in agreement. The enemy commanders are also getting careless with their radio communications.
They're not using proper operational security, so we're getting real-time intelligence on their movements and intentions. Webb studied the map and the positions Maya had identified.
What do you need to make this work?
More ammunition and a clear field of fire, Maya replied.
If you can get us additional supplies, we can hold them off indefinitely. But we need the other sniper teams to coordinate their fire with us. The colonel nodded grimly.
Consider it done. You two have bought us time that we didn't think we had.
Keep doing what you're doing.
As Webb moved away to coordinate with other units, Maya and Elena settled back into their routine of watching, waiting, and striking when the moment was right.
The tattoos on their arms told the story of their journey to this moment, but they were about to add new chapters written in the desert sand.
The enemy forces were regrouping for another assault, but they had learned respect for the Marine snipers who had turned their confident advance into a deadly game of cat and mouse. What the enemy didn't realize was that Maya and Elena Rodriguez were just getting started. They had spent years training for moments like this, and being abandoned by their own command had only made them more determined to prove that the tattooed sisters were not victims to be pitied, but warriors to be feared. The sun reached its peak as Maya Rodriguez wiped sweat from her forehead, careful not to disturb her scope alignment. 72 hours had passed since forward operating base Scorpion had been abandoned by command, and the Rodriguez sisters had transformed from mocked outcasts into the backbone of the Marine defense. Elena lay beside her, tracking enemy movements with the patience of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Their ammunition was running dangerously low. Maya had started the battle with 200 rounds of precision sniper ammunition, and she was down to her last 37 rounds.
Elena was in similar shape, with 42 rounds remaining. Every shot now carried the weight of life and death decisions, not just for the enemy targets, but for the Marines they were protecting. Lieutenant Morrison crawled up to their position carrying a canvas bag that clinked softly with the sound of metal on metal. "Ladies, I've got some good news and some bad news," he said, keeping his voice low to avoid detection by enemy snipers who had been trying to locate their position for the past day.
Maya kept her eye pressed to her scope while listening. "Give us the bad news first, Jake." Morrison's expression was grim. Enemy forces have been reinforced overnight. Intelligence estimates were now facing close to 3,000 hostiles, including a mechanized unit with armored vehicles. They're planning a final assault at sunset. Elena cursed softly in Spanish, a habit she had picked up from their grandmother. "What's the good news?" Morrison opened the canvas bag to reveal boxes of specialized ammunition. Colonel Webb managed to redistribute ammo from the other sniper teams.
"You've got 150 rounds of match-grade ammunition, plus some experimental rounds that the weapons sergeant has been saving for special occasions." Maya finally looked away from her scope to examine the ammunition. Among the standard rounds were several boxes marked with technical specifications she didn't recognize. "What are these experimental rounds?" Morrison grinned for the first time in days. "Armor-piercing incendiary rounds. They're designed to punch through light vehicle armor and create secondary explosions."
The weapons sergeant figured if we're going down, we might as well take as many of them with us as possible. Elena picked up one of the experimental rounds, studying its distinctive black tip.
"Range and accuracy compared to standard ammunition? Same ballistic characteristics as your regular match-grade rounds, but with significantly more stopping power," Morrison replied. "The sergeant recommends them for high-value targets like vehicle crews and weapons teams." The sisters quickly redistributed their ammunition, carefully noting which rounds were standard and which were the experimental armor-piercing rounds. Each bullet now represented a tactical decision that could influence the outcome of the battle. Maya's radio crackled with an intercepted enemy transmission. Over the past 3 days, she had picked up enough Arabic to understand basic tactical communications. What she heard made her blood run cold. "Elena, they're talking about using human shields. Sounds like they've captured some local civilians and plan to use them to cover their advance. Elena's jaw tightened with anger. The use of human shields violated every rule of warfare, but it was a tactic they had encountered before in their previous deployments. It turned every shot into a moral dilemma and psychological warfare designed to paralyze enemy snipers.
Colonel Webb's voice came through their earpieces, steady despite the desperate situation. All units, this is command. Intelligence suggests the enemy is planning to use civilian shields during their final assault. Rules of engagement remain in effect. Do not fire unless you have a clear shot that will not endanger civilian lives. Maya and Elena exchanged glances. They had trained for scenarios involving human shields, but the training had always been academic. Now they were facing the real thing, and the lives of innocent people hung in the balance along with their fellow Marines. The afternoon stretched on with occasional sniper duels as enemy marksmen tried to locate and eliminate the Rodriguez sisters. Maya and Elena had become legendary among the enemy forces, who had started referring to them as the Ghost Sisters because of their ability to appear, strike, and vanish without being detected. Elena's scope picked up movement in the enemy staging area. I've got visual on the civilian shields. Looks like 12 to 15 people, mostly women and children. They're being positioned at the front of the enemy formation. Maya felt sick to her stomach as she confirmed the sighting through her own scope. The civilians were clearly terrified, and some of the children were crying. The enemy fighters were using them as human armor, positioning them to make it impossible for the Marines to return effective fire. This changes everything, Maya said quietly. We can't engage their main force without risking civilian casualties. Elena was already thinking tactically. We can still target their flanks and support elements. The civilians are only covering their main advance. If we can eliminate their heavy weapons teams and command structure, we might be able to disrupt their attack without endangering the shields. Lieutenant Morrison had been listening to their tactical discussion.
Command is asking for recommendations on how to handle this situation. What do you think?
Maya studied the enemy formation through her scope, looking for weaknesses they could exploit.
Tell Colonel Webb that we can still be effective, but we need the other Marine units to focus their fire on the flanking elements while we target command and control personnel. The experimental armor-piercing rounds suddenly became much more valuable. If the enemy was using armored vehicles to support their assault, Maya and Elena could potentially disable them without risking civilian casualties caught in crossfire. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, the enemy forces began their final assault.
The sight was both terrifying and heartbreaking. Hundreds of armed fighters advancing behind a screen of innocent civilians who had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maya identified her first target, an enemy commander positioned behind an armored personnel carrier, directing the assault with hand signals.
The man was using the vehicle for cover, but Maya had a clear shot that wouldn't endanger any civilians. She loaded one of the experimental armor-piercing rounds and calculated the ballistic solution.
The shot rang out across the desert and the enemy commander dropped instantly. But Maya's round had also punched through the thin armor of the personnel carrier, creating a small explosion that sent enemy fighters scrambling for new cover.
The experimental ammunition was proving even more effective than advertised. Elena was tracking a different threat. A heavy machine gun team setting up to provide covering fire for the advancing infantry. The gunners were positioned behind a concrete barrier, but Elena had an angle that would allow her to engage them without threatening the civilian shields. Her shot took out the machine gunner, and she immediately shifted to engage the assistant gunner who was trying to take over the weapon.
Within 30 seconds, she had eliminated the entire weapons team and neutralized a significant threat to the Marine defensive positions. The battle intensified as enemy forces pushed forward, using the civilian shields to advance within assault range of the Marine positions. Maya and Elena continued to engage targets on the flanks and rear areas, but the main enemy force was becoming untouchable due to the presence of innocent people. Colonel Webb made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His voice came through the radio with the weight of command authority. All units, this is command. We have enemy forces using human shields approaching our defensive perimeter. Prepare for close quarters combat. Snipers continue to engage targets of opportunity but do not fire into areas with civilian presence. Maya felt tears of frustration burning her eyes as she watched enemy fighters use innocent people as human armor. Every instinct told her to take the shots that would save her fellow Marines, but she couldn't bring herself to risk civilian lives. The compass tattoo on Elena's wrist seemed to mock her. Which direction was the right one when every choice led to tragedy? Elena made a decision that would define the rest of the battle. Maya, I've got an idea. What if we target the enemy fighters who are controlling the civilians? If we can eliminate the guards, the civilians might be able to escape. It was a desperate plan, but it offered hope in an impossible situation.
Maya began identifying enemy fighters who were clearly guarding or controlling the civilian shields. These targets were legitimate military objectives, and eliminating them might give the innocent people a chance to flee. The sisters began a careful campaign of precision shooting, targeting only the enemy fighters who were directly controlling the civilian shields. Each shot had to be perfect. A miss could hit an innocent person, while a hit might give that person a chance to escape. Maya's first shot eliminated a fighter who was holding a gun to a woman's head. The woman immediately dropped to the ground and began crawling toward the Marine lines. Elena's shot took out another guard, and 2 children broke free and ran toward safety. The enemy commanders quickly realized what was happening and began adjusting their tactics. But the damage was done. Several civilians had escaped, and the human shield formation was beginning to break down.
As night fell completely, the battle reached its climax. Enemy forces were within 50 meters of the Marine defensive perimeter, and ammunition was running critically low across the entire position. Maya and Elena had used their last armor-piercing rounds to disable 2 enemy vehicles, but there were still hundreds of fighters pressing the attack. Morrison crawled up to their position one final time, his face grim with exhaustion and determination.
Ladies, Colonel Webb wants to know if you have any miracles left. We're down to our last magazines, and the enemy is preparing for a final push.
Maya looked at her remaining ammunition, 7 standard rounds and 3 armor-piercing rounds. Elena had similar numbers. After 3 days of continuous combat, they were nearly out of options, but Maya Rodriguez had never surrendered in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. The phoenix tattoo on her shoulder seemed to glow in the muzzle flashes lighting up the desert night. She had risen from destruction before, and she would do it again.
"Tell the colonel we're not done yet," Maya said quietly. "Elena and I have a plan." The final chapter of their battle was about to be written in the desert sand, and the tattooed sisters who had been laughed at and abandoned were preparing to prove that being underestimated was the last mistake their enemies would ever make. The enemy forces had no idea that Maya and Elena Rodriguez were about to turn their greatest weakness, being outnumbered and running out of ammunition, into their most devastating weapon. The tattooed sisters had spent 3 days earning the respect of their enemies through precision and professionalism.
Now they were about to teach them the true meaning of fear.